changes to COVID testing across the UK. The PM tells Parliament anyone in England with a positive lateral flow will no longer have to take a PCR, despite surging cases and more NHS trusts entering emergency measures.
I'm sorry to report that hospital admissions are rising rapidly, doubling around every 9 days, with already more than 15,000 COVID patients in hospital in England.
Relief for holidaymakers. England scraps COVID tests before your flight home. And there are changes in Scotland too. We will explain exactly what all the new rules mean for you. Also on the programme. Cleared. The 4 protesters who toppled the Colston statue in Bristol walk free from court. And the real-life lassie, how top dog Tinsley saved the day.
It's a miracle, you know, how she has that kind of intelligence.
This is the ITV Evening News with Mary Nightingale.
Good evening. A major change to COVID testing rules across the UK was announced today. Anyone who gets a positive result from a lateral flow test but doesn't have symptoms will no longer need to take a PCR to confirm they have the virus. Now, the rules take effect in England on Tuesday and in other nations by tomorrow. In another change, people arriving in England from abroad will no longer have to test before they travel, and we'll have more on that shortly. It all comes as Boris Johnson insisted England is on the right path with COVID restrictions, despite rising cases and pressure on the NHS. Today, more than 194,000 infections were reported right across the UK. And new figures showed a record 3.7 million people had COVID in the last week of 2021. Here's our Deputy Political Editor, Newscaster Astana, on the testing start to the new year for the PM.
MPs came rushing back today. Some ready with their sound bites.
The Prime Minister is chaos.
Others, Tories, with less to say. Well, apart from this one, wrapped up warm with one hope for the new year.
An end to it.
An end to it. That Conservative backbench plea for no more COVID restrictions.
Are you gambling with the NHS, Prime Minister?
That Boris Johnson has been balancing with what is happening on the front line.
I'm sorry to report that hospital admissions are rising rapidly, doubling around every 9 days, with already more than 15,000 COVID patients in hospital in England alone.
So to the disappointment of some backbenchers, he's sticking with Plan B, but to their relief.
This government does not believe we need to shut down our country again.
But he knows the Omicron surge is causing chaos because of staff isolation. So there was this new policy. From next Tuesday in England, if you test positive on a lateral flow but have no symptoms, you no longer need a PCR. Your isolation will begin the day you test positive and end 7 days later if you are double jabbed and have 2 negative lateral flows. However, to qualify for the £500 test and trace support payment, you will still need a PCR result. The aim is not just to cut isolation time, but to stop people with COVID travelling to get a PCR and to take pressure off the testing system.
Actually, the time's been right for this for a long time. We've been doing, hundreds of thousands of really expensive PCR tests every day, and they haven't really had an impact on the pandemic since last summer. We've had lateral flows now for the best part of 6-7 months. Everyone's comfortable with using them. They're easy to do. It's an instant result.
He said genome sequencing tracking variants would be protected because of PCRs in hospitals.
She is a Londoner.
The question is, will it help the many sectors facing staff shortages, including care homes, like Featherton House in Banbury, part of a group badly hit?
We now have, out of 2,300 members of staff across all the homes that we manage, 526 members of staff who've tested positive for COVID.
This chief executive thinks that with vaccines, carers without symptoms shouldn't have to isolate at all.
If we haven't enough staff in the homes, it's very difficult to manage visiting. And it's really important for our residents, especially after the last 2 years, that they get to see their loved ones.
Everyone wants it to be over. The question is whether Boris Johnson's gamble will work. Anushka Astana, ITV News.
Well, surging COVID cases and the huge number of people having to isolate are putting severe strain on the NHS, where staff shortages are impacting on services. More than 20 NHS trusts have now declared a critical incident, meaning priority service could well be under threat. That includes trusts right across the country, from Plymouth and Bristol to Morecambe and Lincolnshire. In Greater Manchester, non-urgent surgeries have been stopped at 17 hospitals, with around 15% of staff there either ill with COVID or isolating. Well, our North of England reporter Hannah Miller sent this report on the impact the virus is having there.
Across Greater Manchester, the pressures of Omicron are fast becoming clear. A critical incident across almost all of the region's hospitals, thousands of operations postponed. Rebecca's been waiting months for life-changing back surgery that was due to take place next Wednesday. Today, her appointment was cancelled.
I run a pub, so a lot of things that I do are lifting and stuff like that. I can't do any of that at the moment.
How do you feel when operations like yours are described as not urgent?
It annoys me. I've waited such a long time for something, for me to have that release of something, hoping that, yes, in the next few days, hopefully I'll be pain-free.
Across Greater Manchester, the number of people in hospital with COVID has risen sharply from around 300 to more than 1,000 in the past 3 weeks. In some hospitals, more than 1 in 5 patients have the virus. And although at the moment many don't need critical care, the pressure is caused by around 15% of staff being off sick or isolating. That's 3 times higher than normal.
I've not experienced anything like this in the years that I've been a consultant in the NHS. So this is a fairly extraordinary situation.
Staff are having to prioritise patients who may have life-threatening conditions. In this room, they're preparing for a scan that could identify cancer. Examinations like this are still going on over the next few weeks, but the challenges facing this hospital are expected to get worse before they get better. And the crisis facing these hospitals is made more challenging by the lack of social care available. Finding places in care homes said to be the most significant difficulty.
We believe there are around 650 people in hospital beds in Greater Manchester who are medically fit to be discharged, but around half of our care homes are currently unable to accept new residents.
Here, many fear that longer waits for treatment will pile more pressure on a healthcare system that's busier than ever, but where normal operations have come to a stop. Hannah Miller, ITV News, Bolton.
OK, so let's take a closer look now at how the virus has spread across England. And the total number of cases in the northwest is more than 155,000 now. Well, in London, which was, of course, initially hardest hit by Omicron, the number is around 1,000 below that. And our health editor, Emily Morgan, is here. So, Emily, the northwest is now, it would seem, the real epicentre of this.
Yeah, it is. I mean, the high rates were never going to just stay in London, and this is exactly what happened in the first few waves of COVID. It started in London and it moved to the north of England. I was in Preston Hospital just before Christmas, where everybody was watching London because they knew that they would be next. And lo and behold, cases are now rising the fastest in the north of England. And that's obvious from the ONS surveillance report, the most recent report out today, which is probably the most accurate snapshot of what is happening in this country. And rates there have more than doubled in just 1 week, up to the 31st of December. They're still going up in London, but they're going up at a much slower pace. And the outbreak isn't just moving geographically, it's also moving through the age groups now, which is quite significant. It's worrying. There's been a big increase in the number of cases in the sort of 50 to 70-year-olds. It's doubled in 1 week. Now, you'd hope most of those people are boosted, but as Patrick Vallance did point out yesterday, we don't know how the older generation are going to fare against Omicron because it's been spreading among the younger population. So I think health officials will be watching that really, really carefully, and they'll be watching the north of England to see how hospitals cope. OK, Emily, thank you. Well, there was some welcome news today for anyone in England worried about planning a holiday. The requirement to test before you come home is being scrapped. Now, people will still have to test when they arrive, but it does remove that nightmare scenario of being stuck abroad after testing positive. It is, though, a change which comes too late for some, as Ben Chapman reports.
And these will go right through, yeah?
For those who were negotiating the airport today, there's now one less thing to worry about. There's little doubt the requirement for extra testing has only added to the stress of travelling, which those leaving Manchester today can now avoid.
It does add on another thing to your journey, especially like I'm a student, so it was another cost.
You don't have the worry of testing positive and getting stuck in a foreign country, of course.
You get another day of holiday, don't you? You don't have to go around running after tests.
From 4 a.m. this Friday, fully vaccinated travellers and under 18s will no longer need to take a test before flying into England. After arrival, they will only need to take a lateral flow test instead of a PCR, and they will no longer need to self-isolate while waiting for the result. But the changes come too late for the Kant family, isolating in Fuerteventura at a cost of £3,000 after David's pre-departure test came back positive. He's now negative.
People are going to come on holiday next week and not having to think about isolation for 7 days and paying again to stay in a country where they can just freely go home whenever they choose. At the moment, I feel as if there's nothing wrong with me, and I feel I could go home tomorrow.
Airlines say that fear has been putting passengers off.
The travel industry's been arguing that the Omicron testing regime has carried an enormous cost with very little benefit. Since it was brought in, passenger numbers here have fallen by 30%, while the number of COVID cases is 5 times higher.
Omicron has been here now for some time, and perhaps the decision could have been made earlier, but we're just delighted that it's been made today, and it really will have a tremendous impact on the travel industry in January.
Many in the industry are now calling for all restrictions to be lifted to give more businesses and passengers peace of mind. Ben Chapman, ITV News, Manchester Airport.
Well, in Scotland, self-isolation rules are changing from midnight tonight. And among those changes announced by the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, the isolation period will be cut from 10 to 7 days for those who test negative twice. Well, our Scotland correspondent Peter Smith joins me now. Peter, this is part of wider changes, isn't it?
Exactly. Well, while in England you've been having discussions about whether Boris Johnson has gone far enough to tackle coronavirus and the Omicron variant, in Scotland it's been the opposite. People saying, has Nicola Sturgeon overreacted by bringing in tough restrictions over Christmas and the New Year, which hit hospitality so severely? But today we saw Scotland has gone from having the strictest rules on isolation. That's now changed, now in line with England, Wales and Northern Ireland, also in line with the no need to take a PCR test if you're not showing symptoms. And interestingly, Nicola Sturgeon now saying even if you're a close contact, you don't have to isolate as long as you're testing negative and fully vaccinated. In her eyes, that means including the boosters. So the first time we're seeing in the UK a booster bonus, a kind of incentive. She also spelled out an interesting shift in her direction. She's known for being very cautious. Now she's talking about issuing a strategy for going forward about how we learn to adapt to the virus. Here's what she said.
This does not, in my view, mean giving up on trying to control COVID completely. The impact of it on individual health and on our collective well-being is too significant for that. But it does mean seeking ways of doing so that are more proportionate, more sustainable and less restrictive.
Now, going from being the strictest in the UK to now talking about living less restrictively and learning to not quite live with the virus but live alongside it is a dramatic shift, and it's one that the rest of the UK will be watching very carefully. Nicola Sturgeon clearly boosted by the evidence that she's seeing on the severity of Omicron.
OK, Peter Smith in Glasgow, thank you. Still to come on the ITV Evening News, the backlash down under over Djokovic's vaccine exemption, and the real-life lassie who came to her owner's rescue. And those stories and more after the break. Join me then. And welcome back. Now, 4 people charged over the toppling of a statue of the slave trader Edward Colston have been cleared of criminal damage. The monument was pulled down and thrown into Bristol Harbour during a Black Lives Matter protest in June 2020. Dan Rivers reports.
This was the moment the so-called Colston 4 emerged from Bristol Crown Court after being sensationally cleared of criminal damage.
We have never been alone in this journey. We've been so supported, and we are, we're such a small part of this, really.
We didn't change history, we rectified history. And this is a victory for Bristol, this is a victory for racial equality, and this is a victory for anyone who wants to be on the right side of history.
The 4 defendants were part of a crowd which toppled the statue of the 17th century slave trader Edward Colston last June. It was dragged through the streets and dumped in the city's harbour. The court was shown CCTV footage highlighting each of the defendants, who didn't deny they were involved. Instead, they claimed their actions were justified because Bristol City Council had failed to remove the controversial statue which so many found offensive. Their acquittal tonight has been seized on as a victory, which goes far beyond Bristol's contentious slave history.
The people did what the city and the establishment wasn't prepared to do, and what they did was just and right.
Historian David Olashoga was one of the expert witnesses at the trial and says this verdict is an important moment in Britain's reckoning with its past.
I think this is a milestone in that journey. What it says is you cannot pretend that a slave trader was just a philanthropist. We cannot ignore the deaths and the enslavement of tens of thousands of people, that they are legitimate parts of British history, and the emotions and the sentiments that they evoke matter.
Colston's bronze now lies in the city's museum as the debate continues about whether other statues elsewhere should also be removed. For some, tonight's verdict will be controversial, but the campaigners who toppled Edward Colston will view this acquittal as a seminal moment in how Britain is coming to terms with its past. Dan Rivers, ITV News.
The tennis world number 1, Novak Djokovic, is tonight waiting to find out if he's going to be allowed to defend his title at the Australian Open. He's being held at Melbourne Airport, where officials are deciding whether or not to allow him into the country. Now, it all follows outrage at him being granted an exemption from strict vaccination rules that he could play in the tournament. Our sports editor, Steve Scott, has the latest.
Victorian officials say Novak Djokovic wasn't given special treatment after being granted a vaccine exemption.
He hadn't even landed, but Novak Djokovic was still managing to make waves.
After he was granted a medical exemption.
As a 9 times winner and reigning Australian Open champion, the world number 1 has always considered Melbourne his second home. But his exemption from vaccination rules has not gone down well down under.
We've all done the right thing. We've all gone out and got our jabs and our boosters, and I think it's an absolute disgrace, and I won't be watching it.
I really don't agree with there being one rule for one and another rule for others, so I feel that there should be he shouldn't be allowed to come.
I guess he might even get booed when he gets up onto the court.
A handful of players have been granted an entry exemption, the majority because they'd been infected by COVID in the past 6 months. Djokovic hasn't said how he got his or revealed his vaccination status, though he's always defended the right to choose.
So we await his presentation and what evidence he provides to support that. If that evidence is insufficient, then he won't be treated any different to anyone else, and he'll be on the next plane home.
Cases in Melbourne are currently at a record high. Tournament organisers insist Djokovic wasn't offered preferential consideration. But as spectators must be jabbed to get entry, one former champion believes the Serbian star should be more transparent.
Look, I think it would be in his best interest to openly speak about it, embrace the situation, and maybe let everybody in a little bit what he went through to get this special exemption. I think it would help his cause.
One more kiss, Novak, please. Just to the side here.
Djokovic is under no obligation to reveal anything, but you sense the reception he'll get might depend on whether he does or not. Steve Scott, ITV News.
Here, Labour has warned that rising energy costs will be a disaster for thousands of families. Bills could rise by as much as 50% due to surging wholesale gas prices. Boris Johnson insists the government is taking steps to help people cope with those price rises. Here's our consumer editor, Chris Choi.
Energy costs are rising like never before as wholesale prices soar. This single mum simply doesn't know how she'll pay more.
The more people are going to struggle and the more families are going to struggle. So it needs to end and it needs to be put a stop to so that people can afford it and afford to live.
It's been estimated that all this could push 2 million more households into fuel poverty unless urgent action is taken, which is why today government was meeting with energy firms to discuss the options. Average bills could go from £1,277 a year to around £1,865. Options include removing VAT, £61 of a typical bill, cutting environmental and social policy levies, typically £159, and changing plans that would add at least £1.8 billion to bills as the cost of dealing with failed energy firms. Today in Parliament, pressure on the Prime Minister to announce a new energy plan.
Even the Tory backbenchers have finally accepted Labour's call to cut VAT on energy bills. So will he finally stand up to his Chancellor and do the same?
Mr. Speaker, let me remind her the Warm Homes discount already. 2.2 million people supported to the tune of £140 a week. Pensioners supported with £300 through the winter fuel payment. The cold weather payments for 4 million people.
In the past, energy firms have made large profits, so isn't it time now for them to help customers more?
We absolutely stand ready to help and support our customers.
The industry says there have been no recent profits and predicts widespread misery for bill payers.
It's going to have economy-wide impacts, and we want to make sure that people are protected in the short term, but also in the medium to long term. What we're looking for is government to think about, how we make sure we've got more domestic homegrown energy.
Energy use is hard to avoid, just as hard to afford. Now government has only weeks to find a solution. Chris Choi, ITV News.
And finally, the real-life lassie who helped save her owner. When police in the United States found Shiloh shepherd Tinsley wandering alone on a bridge, they tried to take her to safety, but Tinsley was determined to show them something. And that's when they noticed the vehicle, which had rolled off the road. Chloe Keedy has this dog's remarkable tale.
This is the story of a dog who went to extraordinary lengths for her owner. Along the middle of a busy American highway, in fact, across a state border and onto this bridge, where police officers spotted her and began trying to get her to safety.
All units that were up there on the scene tried to corral the dog, try to get him in a cruiser. There was passerbys that tried to lure him, I think, with some treats, that kind of thing. But he wouldn't really get within 8 or 10 feet of anybody.
Because Tinsley was on a mission. The determined dog led officers from New Hampshire back into the state of Vermont until, beneath a gap in the crash barrier, they saw this, the wreckage of a pickup truck with Tinsley's owner lying badly injured nearby.
Next thing you know, the cops were there, and it was all because of her. She's my little guardian angel, it's a miracle, how she has that kind of intelligence.
Cam was suffering from hypothermia when officers found him. Thanks to Tinsley, he was taken to hospital and survived. Surely that deserves a treat.
She'll get some venison, probably burger tonight, and maybe some back straps with it.
A worthy dinner for this daring and very devoted dog. Chloe Keedy, ITV News.
There we are, a story to make you smile there. And that is all for now. Tom is here with News at 10, but from me and all the evening news team, bye-bye.